Thank you, Stephen, and thank you, everybody. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to elders past and present. I wanted to talk today, the terrible kind of Dylan joke, which I'm not quite sure why I put there in the title, but I want to talk today a bit about the way we think about fiction in this space, which seems to me to be quite a complex question, and one that I have to say my feelings about never seem to really settle down. I find that I change my mind about it all the time. So I think what I was going to do today was perhaps rehearse some of my changing mind around this kind of space. So look, in September last year, I woke up one day, and in that way you sometimes do, to kind of 27 emails and all these notifications on social media, because there's a company in America called Colossal, and they'd secured funding for a project to resurrect mammoths, kind of Jurassic Park style, so they could be reintroduced onto the Arctic tundra. And the scheme had various kind of objectives. Some of it was about developing kind of genetic methods that could be used in de-extinction. But the one they wanted to talk about the most was this idea that if you put mammoths onto the tundra, it might slow down the melting of the permafrost and kind of delay or even kind of prevent the release of methane from that area. Because one of the problems we have at the moment is this kind of burps of methane coming up from there. Now, so as rewilding schemes go, it's a pretty bonkers plan, but it isn't, completely fanciful. One of the things that's happening up on the permafrost is that because you've got these kind of shifting patterns of vegetation, and as the ground warms, the trees and the moss trees and moss are kind of replacing the grass that would once have grown there. They're darker and they absorb more heat. So it's one of those kind of feedbacks that you get in the climate system. So you have this kind of, the albedo is becoming darker, it's absorbing more heat, it's melting faster. As it melts, the methane comes out of the ground. And the idea is that because the mammoths used to be there, they would slow this process down by knocking over the trees, by eating the moss. And the idea is also that their dung would fertilise the grass. So it's a kind of way, it's one of these kinds of, geoengineering kind of schemes. Now, there's some kind of precedence for that. In the 1990s, they did a scheme where they reintroduced wolves into Yellowstone, which I'm sure many of you have read about. Their presence brought the elk population under control. It allowed the beaver colonies and willow trees to re-establish themselves. I would note that in New South Wales, we spend our time ripping willow trees out because they destroy the native rivers here, rather than being something you want to reintroduce into the native rivers. And they actually have to run these kind of schemes where people go through the Blue Mountains every year and rip the saplings out, because with willows, they seed themselves, and there's just huge numbers from every tree, and once they grow, they just destroy the riverbanks. But there you needed more willows. And what happened was that, that kind of altered the hydrology of the rivers and the streams, and as the effects of that kind of trophic cascade kind of flowed through the system, everything was transformed. When whalers killed the whales in the Southern Ocean, what you would have expected was an explosion in the krill population, because the krill is what the whales eat. But in fact, you saw a collapse in the krill population because the krill, rely upon the fertilising from the whale poo. So there was this kind of, it's another one of those things about these kind of complex webs that life kind of lives in. Now, this scheme with the mammoths seems to me to be, you can see why you'd be worried about the Arctic. When I wrote this talk a month or two ago, the consensus was the Arctic's warmed at least 3 times the speed of the rest of the world over the past decade. Like 2 or 3 days ago, there's an article saying, well, no, in the Barents Sea, it's warming at 7 times the rate of the rest of the world. And there's something really dizzying about that. That kind of sense that, you all know what I'm talking about, that kind of sense that every time you look at the internet, there's another story about something moving faster than anybody thought it could. That kind of sense that the ground is literally kind of melting away from underneath you. But, up in the Arctic, temperatures have, been rising by they've risen a degree in the past decade, heat waves growing in frequency and intensity. You've got massive wildfires. In 2021, the fires in Siberia were larger than all the other wildfires on Earth combined. The situation is the same as it is everywhere. But what it looks like is we're moving towards this kind of catastrophic release of the methane. The IPCC has this wonderful term for that. They call it a large-scale discontinuity. you know, and we're moving towards large-scale discontinuities on a number of fronts. You know, so you can kind of see why you'd be wanting to talk this up. But, you know, once you actually dig into this idea, it's, you know, it's kind of half wacky, half worrisome. You know, these mammoths they're talking about making, they're actually not mammoths in any meaningful sense. They'll be Asian elephants that have been genetically modified to have hair and tusks and to be resistant to cold. You know, so you know, not actually a mammoth. You know, and I mean, just ethically, I mean, it's really worrying, the notion that you take something that's as kind of intelligent and acculturated and sophisticated as an elephant and kind of do that to it, like try and make something else with it. And, you know, even if you put those kinds of ethical concerns to one side, there are these really big scientific hurdles. You know, the speed and scale at which these kind of Franken mammoths would need to be produced is completely implausible. One estimate that I looked at said that there are 22.8 million square kilometres of vulnerable permafrost. So even assuming only one mammoth per 10 square kilometres, that means we'll need nearly 3 million mammoths to make a difference. Now, and another estimate says that during the last glacial there were 200 million mammoths roaming around in the Arctic, on the tundra. You know, so that's a lot of prehistoric pachyderms. I would point out that part of their way of doing this, though, is they're going to invent artificial wombs, and they're going to grow the mammoths in the artificial wombs. You know, and you're kind of like, cool. So, like, I like that your technology is based on this thing that's set. We'll just whip it up. That shouldn't be too difficult. But yes. But look, the story for me had this really quite other resonance, because when I was writing my last novel, Ghost Species, which imagines the kind of creation of a Neanderthal child, one of the central conceits, one of the things I began it with, was this idea of de-extincting mammoths to try and slow down the melting of the permafrost. Now, the weird thing is there's been a scheme kicking around for a while to do that, but I'd kind of come up with it as kind of science fiction, as kind of, you know, parallel convergent evolution. And I guess it shouldn't feel odd that something that you've created has become real. It's kind of one of the perils of writing any kind of fiction that's set in the near future. It's something that's happened to me before, you know, a couple of times, most obviously with Clade, and there's a moment at the end of Clade, the novel I wrote before Ghost Species, at the end where the melting of the ice has kind of shifted the rotation of the planet slightly, so you're getting this kind of wobble in the planet, and it was just something I made up. You know, it's like, but by the time, just after the book came out, there's an article saying, well, look, the shifting of the ice is causing perturbations in the planet's rotation. You know, so there's this kind of sense that you're making stuff up, but the world is moving so fast that it's kind of lapping the process of making things up, and it's a very disconcerting kind of experience. You know, in both cases, there's a real charge around it, because I wasn't just trying to predict some new technology or social upheaval. I was trying to give shape to that kind of, I guess, to the kind of growing derangement of climate catastrophe and the kind of social consequences of it. And so that kind of seeing something like the mammoths come into being it's like feeling like that wave's breaking over you. It's a really, really strange feeling. It seems to me there's also something really unsettling, or, you know, even kind of uncanny about that sense the future is already here. That sense that the boundary between now and what's coming is becoming porous. You know, that sense that, you know, these disasters that we thought were there are here now. We're in the middle of them, you know, and it's, you know, something that's been very apparent over the last couple of years, I think. And it's kind of, as, you know, as if we're kind of caught in this kind of world of hauntings, or perhaps we're hauntings in a world that we no longer recognise. I'm not actually sure if there's a word to describe that. Stephen and I were talking about it before, but, you know, that kind of sense of a kind of vanishing yet already existing future. It's clearly related to that kind of Derrida's notion of hauntology, and some writers like Mark Fisher have written really eloquently about the idea of kind of nostalgia and lost futures, but, you know, if there's not a word for it, there should be. I should probably work through Glenn Albrecht's dictionary. You know, but the funny thing is that porous is kind of what Ghost Species was meant to explore. You know, one of the book's starting points was the way the past has begun to bleed into the present. You know, I was reading the other day about Lake Mead, which is the giant lake behind the Hoover Dam in America on the Colorado River. It, you know, provides water for 40 million people. It provides electricity for 8 million people. Its water levels are down to something like a third of what they are. There's no sign of the drought breaking. You know, it's a really major disaster over there. But as the water levels are dropping, because it's right by Las Vegas, all these bodies keep turning up in the water. Like, as the water drops away, they find like another, 44-gallon drum with a body in it. Someone's thrown into the water. But, that kind of sense, it happened here during the drought. There were towns coming out of the lakes up in the mountains. That kind of sense that, those extraordinary pictures from Europe of the shapes of the medieval buildings appearing on the grass, because the water table's dropped so far. That kind of sense that the past is bleeding into the present. Robert Macfarlane talks, and I think it's something that captures something about the way these kind of invert, life and death and interment and disinterment. He talks about these as kind of Anthropocene unburials. And it's such a great term, this kind of idea of the Anthropocene unburial. But they're part of a kind of larger convulsion, this kind of derangement of temporality in which human time and geological time have started to collapse into each other. And the events and it's a process that's both terrifying, but as, Delia Faulkner's observed, it's also kind of oddly evocative of other much older ways of understanding the world, kind of ways in which these things would have been kind of signs and wonders. Delia talks about this observation kind of recalling Latour's argument that humans have so transformed the planet, so kind of implicated it in our lives that it's not entirely fanciful to imagine the planet is speaking through those unburials. She kind of interprets them as cries of deep distress. I kind of wonder whether that's quite the right term, whether we mightn't be reaching for something else, some term that captures the kind of inhuman scale of these kind of planetary systems, their kind of indifference. But, whether that's the case or not, that sense of kind of temporal derangement, of kind of collapsing and multiplying disjunction, is one of the things I wanted to write about in Ghost Species, and it's right there in the kind of novel's fabric, from the kind of creation of this kind of Neanderthal child, Eve, to the other experiments going on around her, so the bringing back of the mammoths, the extincting of thylacines, and in fact in the book's final sections where kind of catastrophe arrives and history kind of starts to run backwards. So I suspect when I describe writing it that way it sounds a bit abstract, but it's also a very personal book. I started writing it in 2016, just after my father died. It was published like a couple of weeks after my mum died in 2020, so it was kind of written across that period of both my parents dying. I did all of the editing on the book during the bushfires, and if any of you are from Sydney, you can remember, and there was just months where, like the whole city was choked with smoke the whole time, and so you're doing this weird thing, we're writing this book about fires and the end of the world and this kind of sense of encroaching disaster, while, my friend, I've got a friend who's an anaesthetist, he's saying, well, they've cancelled surgery again because there's smoke in the operating room and I can't work. Like, my kids are home from school again because they can't go to school because there's too much smoke. Like, this kind of sense that you're writing about this thing and it's actually happening around you. It's kind of that kind of sense of blurring was very, very powerful when I was writing it. So in that sense, it's very much a book about kind of grief, about kind of personal and planetary grief, and it's about trying to give sense to that feeling of loss, shape to that kind of feeling of loss. I've always thought that one of the things we do with fiction, with poetry, is we give shape to things that are difficult to express in words. Like, in a weird kind of way, we use those forms to capture feeling. And I always think of novels particularly as kind of architectures of feeling. Like, they're kind of ways of communicating experience, the texture of things, the kind of what it feels like to be. And they're things that are actually quite difficult to describe. You have to kind of do them in a kind of totality with the work. And I think with Ghost Species and with Eve, I was kind of thinking there might be a way of giving shape to that kind of strangeness, of that kind of moment. Now, the idea of loneliness is really embedded in the book. You have this kind of solitary child that's been created kind of out of time. And there's a lot in it about the kind of radical aloneness of being like that. But it's not the only seem to be a way of talking about a much larger kind of loneliness. There's an amazing recording, you can hear it on YouTube if you want to hear it, of a bird known as I'm not sure I can say this properly, but it's the u'u, which lived on Kauai in Hawaii. And it was once common on the island, but there was kind of habitat destruction, the introduction of rats and mongooses, which is what you obviously want on a Pacific island, meant that its numbers kind of collapsed. There's really fascinating stuff about the snails on all of the Hawaiian islands, and they're all being driven extinct, and there's people who actually kind of mind the last endling snails and look after them, so they're doing this weird thing. We've got these kind of enclosures where they've put these crazy snails that they have, because they're being eaten by the African snails, and they kind of mind them, and over time they're all dying. And kind of amazing thing to do, to be kind of tending these last members of a species. But the birds, this bird kind of, the numbers collapsed after the introduction of these species. By the 1980s, there were only a handful left. And the last time anyone saw one was in 1985, but in 1987 they heard the mating cry of a solitary male in the bush, and someone recorded it. So you got this bird calling out to a female when there's nobody else left. It's the last of its kind, and it's never going to find anyone. And it is the loneliest sound you'll ever hear. It's extraordinary. I think that kind of grief of encountering the last member of a species isn't, something that many of you will be familiar with. You see it also in that amazing video of the last thylacine pacing up and down in its cage, and it's really, these kind of endlings, to use that term, there's a kind of mute power I think they hold that's really difficult to comprehend. Now there are also human analogues. In 1911 in California, there was a man known as Ishi, was brought to the University of California. Some of you may know the story. In Berkeley, after he'd been taken into custody near a slaughterhouse in Butte County. Ishi was about 50. He was the last known member of the Yahi, who were the southernmost of the Yana people who lived in the Sierra Nevada in Northern California. When Europeans arrived in the region in the 18th century, the Yahi were believed to have numbered between 1,500 and 3,000. But by the beginning of the 20th century, dispossession, disease, massacres had reduced their number to just 4. There was Ishi, his mother, his uncle, and his younger sister. And after an encounter with a group of miners in 1908, that group was dispersed. And after Ishi was separated from his uncle and sister, his mother died. So at Berkeley, where he spent the last 5 years of his life, Ishi was interviewed extensively by members of the university's anthropology and linguistics department, and everyone was there, Sapir, everybody was there. They all interviewed him. And as the last kind of speaker of his language, which was a dialect of Yana, his ability to communicate with the staff of the university was limited, but they recorded it. So Edward Sapir recorded some of it. Other staff at the university encouraged him to share his stories, traditions, songs, and they often got him to perform displays of his skill making bows and arrows for visitors. And in return, he was paid $25 a week and allowed to work as a janitor in the museum. So the unequal nature of that relationship's always been controversial, and a lot of the attention has focused on the actions of the head of the museum, Alfred Kroeber, whose wife Theodora Kroeber later on wrote this incredibly successful book about Ishi. Ishi used to call Alfred Kroeber Big Cheap. And so there's, you read the accounts of it, and there's kind of no question that Kroeber cared for Ishi, but it was a very unequal relationship, and he used him to benefit his career, and after his death he removed Ishi's brain and sent it to researchers at the Smithsonian in violation of Ishi's wishes. A guy who wrote a book, Oren Starn, who wrote a book about the two men, said Ishi was genuinely a friend, but he was also a specimen. So Kroeber's also notable because he was the father of Ursula Le Guin. Now, like the other Kroebers, Le Guin largely avoided speaking about Ishi. If you want to go to her blog, there's an entry about Ishi, which sounds deliberately evasive. It says, Ishi died 13 years before I was born, so I have no nice anecdotes about knowing him when I was a child. I'm sorry. And I must say, I've only ever seen one interview where she's asked about it on video, and, she dismisses, someone says, do you think that this experience fed into your writing? And she's visibly annoyed by the question and just dismisses it out of hand. Now, I have to say, given the number of solitary anthropologists landed on, on planets on their own, all those kind of isolates and lonely figures in her fiction, the highly anthropological bent of a lot of the fiction, I've got a Native American friend in America who loathes Le Guin's writing because she thinks it's all just an act of cultural appropriation. I don't know that I do think that, but it's interesting that she thinks that. You know, it seems difficult to credit that it was not part of her writing. Now, there's been a kind of shift in the understanding of issue news experience in recent years, over the last 20 or 30 years. And that's actually been partly because there was a book edited by Le Guin's brothers pulling together essays about Ishi. But there's been a real effort to kind of separate his story from the frame in which those researchers who studied him placed it, you know, because they controlled the terms on which the songs were released, which songs were released, what went out. So all of the recordings have been moved into the Library of Congress. You can go and listen to them if you want to. And there's been much more of an attempt to try and understand Ishi's kind of resilience and his kind of ability to adapt in these kind of just unspeakably difficult kind of circumstances. You know, the way he'd been severed from his land and his culture and his family, and kind of the scale of the loss that he was trying to deal with. But the thing that's always struck me as incredibly powerful about the story is that his name wasn't actually Ishi. Ishi is the word for man in his language. And in his culture, you couldn't tell someone your name unless you're introduced by a member of your own culture to them. So he couldn't tell Krober or anybody his name because there was nobody left to do that. You know, and as he actually said, I have no name because there were no people to name me. You know, and there's something about that statement which is a kind of recognition of something I think we often forget, which is that extinction, whether we're talking about a species or a culture, isn't just about the loss of the animal or the people. It's not just about the kind of biological loss. You know, it's not about genetic inheritance. You know, it's not about a diminishment of the larger web of life. It's about ways of being in the world. We lose ways of being in the world. We lose relationships with our animals. We lose culture. You know, as the philosopher Tom Van Doren's observed, extinction is never a sharp, singular event, something that begins rapidly, takes place, and then is over and done with. Instead, it's a slow unravelling of intimately entangled ways of life that begins long before the death of the last individual and continues to ripple long afterwards. So, that obviously has relevance to those, you know, vaporware mammoths that Colossal are talking about. You know, elephants possess culture, elephants possess traditions. You know, elephants have an awareness of death. You know, they grieve. You know, they're highly sophisticated animals. You know, so even if you manage to create something that looks like a mammoth, it's not going to be a mammoth in any meaningful sense. It's not going to have the cultures that made mammoths. It's not going to have, you know, the traditions that mammoths enacted. It's going to be this kind of weird, you know, homunculus that you've made, you know. And I think that idea of the kind of significance of connection, the kind of webs of meaning and connection that sustain us both as kind of species and as individuals is kind of right in the kind of fabric of ghost species, as is that kind of idea of the loneliness of inhabiting a world where other species are disappearing at a terrifying rate. But you know, the other thing I wanted the novel to do is to grapple with a series of questions about how we're going to live in a world where, you know, unspeakable loss is already inescapable. You know, I'm sure lots of you are familiar with these questions. Some of the more catastrophic scenarios seem to be less likely now, but you know, the chances of limiting heating to 1.5 degrees are now basically nothing. You know, 2 degrees is looking unlikely. You know, you would have said, although there's some change taking place, you know, you can kind of see the hard work of reducing emissions is starting to dawn on people at the moment. You know, and, you know, you all understand the consequences of that. You know, heating of 2 degrees means widespread extinction and ecosystem collapse. It means the loss of 99% of coral reefs, large-scale movements of people. I mean, all of the stuff that you know. It also, I've been working on some stuff about Antarctica, and, you know, the thing that's really clear when you talk to the scientists and the glaciologists is that, you know, the ice sheet in West Antarctica is in a state of kind of unstoppable collapse at this point. You know, sea level rise is coming, there's nothing we can do about it. You know, so I mean, there's this kind of sense that's kind of bearing down on us. And and against all of that, the kind of fires and floods and pandemics the last few years are going to look like warm-up acts, And it's really difficult to think about. It's difficult stuff to kind of get your head around. I mean, I find it very hard to think about. And it's even harder to write about. I mean, how do you engage with disaster on that scale? How do you think about possibility and inevitability? And what's the kind of role of fiction in this space? Is it to bear witness, to agitate, to console? Like, what's it supposed to do? The questions I thought a lot about when I was writing Clade, which was published a few years before Ghost Species. People often talk about Clade as hopeful, but I'm never quite sure that's quite how I'd describe it. Certainly if you're one of the millions of people who are displaced or die in it, it wouldn't feel terribly hopeful. It always seems to me that all disaster, this has real bearing on fiction, I think, which is that disaster is intimate, catastrophe is personal. These aren't abstract things; they're things that happen to people, to animals. There's a kind of personal dimension to all of this. But it is a book that I think tries to be realistic about what's coming and tries to kind of open a space to imagine change by insisting on possibility. But in Ghost Species, I kind of wanted to go further. I wanted to think about a world where the worst has already happened. Not I would point out as an excuse to write about breakdown and violence, but as a way of imagining how we might live in the recognition of that inevitability. Perhaps I could talk about this in the questions, but I am pretty resistant to a particular kind of cookie-cutter dystopia and particular kinds of narratives about collapse. I mean, it seems to me that, the historical evidence does not bear out fantasies of collapse, and there's something about our cultural insistence on narratives of collapse rather than narratives of survival that should tell us something. We'll talk about that later. But what I want to do is to find some way of thinking about how do you write about living with the knowledge of unstoppable loss. Like, how do you do that? Now, one solution might be to find new forms that are capable of kind of containing and expressing that grief. Ali Smith, who's a writer I admire very much, and I think in her, well, it was a quartet, there's now 5 of them, but in the Seasons books, I don't know if you've read the 5th one, it's like that. It's like fantasy writers when they can't be stopped. They write a trilogy and then it's a tetralogy. You see things in the shops. You used to see those DVD packs and they call them the quadrilogy, and you'd be like, it's a tetralogy. There's already a perfectly good word for it. I don't actually usually care about that stuff, but that one used to drive me crazy. But yeah, I mean, one of the things I really loved about the Seasons books was the way they kind of pushed the novel into new configurations to kind of capture something of the kind of altered temporality and kind of strangeness of the moment. It was there in the way she wrote them. She wrote them really, really fast. The idea was these 4 books about a season, they come out really fast. And then she started writing them and kind of Corona came along and she's trying to write them clearly through that process. They're really fascinating books, both for the way they're trying to think about time, but also for the kind of means of their creation, the kind of method and context of their creation is all about these kind of altered temporalities. But she recently wrote a piece of a thing where she talked about the idea of formal feeling, which was a term she borrowed from the Italian novelist and essayist Claudia Durastanti. If any of you haven't read Durastanti's novel, which I'm now completely blanking on the name of, came out this year or late last year. It's a really fascinating book and really interesting, with a really interesting kind of instability around genre. I mean, are you reading memoir? Are you reading a novel? Are you reading an essay? There's something really interesting going on under the surface of it. And it's about deafness and it's about family. It's a really interesting book. But for Smith, she says that conditions in crisis demand a shift in the way we write. Innovations capable of capturing and expressing the particularity of the world we inhabit. And she quotes Virginia Woolf's desire to step outside of human consciousness into a world which one could slice with one's thoughts as a fish slices the water with his fin, grazing the stems of the water lilies. But, it seems to me that she could also have taken that kind of observation a Virginia Woolf said on or about December 1910, human nature changed to the present day. And you could say that, perhaps on or about December 29, human consciousness in Australia changed. Perhaps in February 2020, human consciousness changed. This kind of sense that what's going on around us is changing us at a kind of psychic, cultural level. And again, I think Adeline Jones-Pritchard talked last night about kind of genre. I mean, it seems to me that one of the mistakes people make around a lot of the fictionist areas to talk about it as a genre. It's clearly not a genre. It's a condition like modernity. It kind of touches everything. Speaking for myself, I really when I read that piece of Smith's, I was really struck by it because it's very much. I feel a great deal of sympathy with that kind of idea of wanting to find new ways of writing, wanting to find new modes of kind of this kind of formal feeling with which to talk about these things. When I began writing Ghost Species, I wanted to find a way of writing that, somehow kind of elided or erased that distance between me and the world. It was partly because I wanted to write directly from the moment, both from that kind of, I was talking about that sense of kind of rawness and escalating catastrophe around us, but it's also I wanted to find a way of writing fiction which kind of inhabited the moment, which felt like it was kind of riding the wave of what we were living in. The novelist and essayist Daisy Hildyard talks about what she calls the second body, which is a kind of a radically unbounded second self that extends outwards and is entangled with everything else. Amitav Ghosh talks about the insistent, inescapable continuities of the Anthropocene. And they're both kind of ways, I think, of trying to capture and delineate that way that climate catastrophe collapses time and space, causing the deep past to erupt into the present, but also kind of bringing the distant close. Now, I wanted to find a way of altering the way I actually wrote fiction so that I could do the same, so that I could actually kind of process that weirdness that I was talking about into the fiction, and in a sense there was no barrier left between me and what I was writing. And as I did that, what you started to feel was like, that you were kind of processing your kind of fears and anxieties directly onto the page. I mean, it was like writing in a really exposed and raw kind of way. I also think that framing of the question is really useful because it seems to me to suggest a slightly more constructive way to think about fiction that's responsive to the world we inhabit. Because of the way the conversation around fiction and environmental crisis is framed, you often get a kind of expectation or demand that, books about climate and the environment do some kind of work. This kind of sense that, they need to make things happen. And I, perhaps I'm just talking about the way I work, perhaps I'm just talking about my own, the kind of way I approach fiction, but I always feel a bit uneasy about that. I find that kind of instrumentalising of the fiction a little strange, because we don't make the same demands of other kinds of novels. We don't expect books about marital discord to end divorce. We don't expect crime novels to bring down the carceral system. If the test for a novel about climate is that it ends the climate crisis, it seems to me we've probably failed before we begin. So I'm not quite, running Auden's line about poetry makes nothing happen. It always strikes me as perhaps it's the wrong question. At the same time, though, I don't think the assumption's completely wrong. We kind of live in this moment of planetary emergency, and if fiction's going to be relevant, it has to be more than just aestheticising. It needs to be responsive to that emergency. And so I do think that for anyone writing in this space, there's a kind of ethical and political imperative at work, because there isn't, why are you writing in this space? Do you know what I mean? Why do it if you don't think it's got that imperative? And there is something about thinking that you could write without that imperative at work, which makes me very, very uneasy. Now, to think about why you might do it, I think one of the reasons you might do it is to simply kind of for it to be there. While I was writing this talk a few weeks ago, the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority finally released its report into the bleaching event last summer. The event wasn't unexpected. I've been working on a non-fiction project that involves coral reefs. I had a pretty good idea what it was going to say. And I still remember sitting there looking at that map with the red dots all over it of kind of severe bleaching just everywhere, and that feeling where you just you know, that you feel sick when you look at it, like the kind of, you know, and that kind of sense of grief, of another loss, of the knowledge that there are going to be more of them is, like I said before, really difficult to bear. And I think that grief is made even harder by that sense that the world is kind of, there's a kind of cognitive dissonance between the fact that the world is burning and that conversation is not reflected in the politics, it's not reflected in the media discourse, you know. So that kind of sense of these two things being out of line, I think, is very difficult. And I do think fiction is a kind of way of dealing with that feeling. It kind of makes a space where we don't have to fight that feeling that we're slowly going mad. You know, like it kind of captures the world as it is and registers what's happening. You know, and by bearing in witness in that way, I think it helps us kind of bear the weight of that loss. I mean, I know that's one of the things I turn to a lot of the fiction in this space for, like that sense that there's that terrible old C.S. Lewis line about we read to know we're not alone, but there's a level at which I think often with this stuff that is actually what you're doing. You're wanting to know that you're not the only one who can see what's going on. But I was thinking it kind of does more than that. Donald Rumsfeld famously talked about known unknowns and unknown unknowns. You know, and his point was that we shouldn't let the lack of evidence that Iraq was supplying weapons of mass destruction to terrorist groups blind us to the possibility that they might be. You know, so it's completely grotesque pretext for war. I still struggle with the adulation for John Howard, war criminal. But, you know, I think it's a kind of idea with some relevance, because when we think about the future, part of what makes it terrifying is that we don't know what's coming. Like that kind of sense that it's too big and too complicated and too difficult. Like, how do we even think about it? And that sense of a kind of unimaginable future can be very, you know, it can kind of stop us in our tracks. And that actually, weirdly enough, is one of the reasons I ended up writing Clade, which was that I found myself back in the early, around 2010, trying to imagine the world in a century and finding I couldn't. So the novel was, in a weird kind of way, like a thought experiment that was designed to make the future comprehensible to myself, of kind of understanding what living through it might feel like. So while I don't think the role of speculative modes like science fiction is narrowly predictive, that process of imagining and describing possible futures does give us kind of frameworks that let us think our way past the assumptions and ideologies that kind of define the present, you know, kind of transform the unknown into a known unknown. Now, you see that process given really full expression in the work of Kim Stanley Robinson, and perhaps most significantly his last novel, The Ministry for the Future, which I imagine a number of you have read. But in it, you know, Robinson imagines a kind of possible history of the next 50 or 60 years, and the kind of profound changes it might bring. So for lots of people, the most memorable part of Ministry is the opening sequence, where he imagines a wet bulb heat wave that kills tens of millions of people in India. First time I read that opening chapter, I had to put down the book and go outside for a little while. Because nothing in it was news. Like, I kind of understood the danger of wet bulb heat waves. I understood the unequal impact of climate impacts like heat. But there was something about Robinson coalescing that event and make it real. It was so terrifying. I felt sick the first time I read it. But the thing that I actually think makes Ministry really significant is actually its desire to kind of show that there's a way through, and to kind of insist that however frightening the future looks, societies are dynamic systems. History keeps happening. You know, perhaps you could argue his vision is too utopian. I must say I am sceptical about some of the changes he imagines can be achieved so rapidly. And I think there are assumptions embedded in some of his ideas about habitat preservation that probably need to be talked about. But that's kind of not really the point. The point of the book is that the mere act of imagining that future helps create a space for us to think about the future in constructive and creative ways. Now, it seems to me that given Ali Smith's idea of a formal feeling, and I think this is really interesting, Ministry is also kind of interesting because of the way it kind of refuses conventional fictional form. So Robinson's fiction has always been impatient with many of the shibboleths of literary writing. He once declared show don't tell is, I love this quote, a zombie idea killed 40 years ago by the publication in English of Gabriel Garcia Marquez' 100 Years of Solitude, yet still sadly wandering the literary landscape, confusing people. You know, and one of the things he's done, he talks about the kind of poetry of telling. You know, he's made kind of the discursive is kind of, and info dumps are kind of one of the things he's made an art form on in his fiction. But the weird thing with Ministry is it doesn't read like fiction, it reads like a kind of imaginative history, like a kind of future history. And there's a kind of fury and a kind of despair that are kind of undergirding it that give that instability in generic form a kind of electric energy. You know, there's something that feels really necessary about it when you're reading it in a way I think a lot of rather more polite fiction in that space doesn't. But also, I mean, I actually wonder though whether the real power of fiction in this space is to achieve something deeper again. Like a lot of people I was for a while, enormously impressed by the arguments of Timothy Morton and their idea of climate catastrophe as a kind of hyper-object, something so immense and complex as to be resistant to conceptualization. I've talked about it at multiple writers' festivals. You know, it seemed to me to kind of offer an explanation for the way so many people seem to recoil from the idea of the reality of the climate crisis, the inability to kind of think about it. But I have to say I've grown more resistant to the idea over time, because it seems more and more to be like a kind of slippery obfuscation. It seems to me that the causes and the mechanisms of the climate crisis are relatively easy to conceptualise. They're just not much fun for those of us who have benefited from the process to have to conceptualise. Now, Jameson famously talks about it being easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism. I also wonder whether that's true. Amitav Ghosh, in his most recent book, observes that it's patently untrue. The majority of the world's population did not live in capitalist societies for much of the 20th century. Even in the West, the normal functioning of capitalism was mostly suspended for years during the two world wars. Now, what Ghosh says has never been suspended is the dynamics of global empire, of exploitation and extraction. And I quote, "That which is really harder to imagine than the end of the world is the end of absolute geopolitical dominance by the West." So I wonder whether what we really want from the fiction in this space is a kind of decolonisation of that imagination, a kind of opening up of new possibilities, of new ways of seeing things. You know, part of that's got to involve breaking down some of those false dichotomies between nature and society, that kind of Cartesian split, breaking down the dichotomies between us and the world, you know, recognising the degree to which everything is connected, the existence of other ways of being, but it's also about trying to think about the kind of historical dimensions of the crisis, you know, and this kind of insistence that the crisis is something that's 50 years old kind of erases the historical basis of it. And doing that forces us to think in different ways about the future implications of it. Now, I think that's already happening, of course. There are Indigenous writers like Claire Coleman, who's here today, Alexis Wright, Evelyn Araluen, Tara June Winch. They're producing fiction which I think delineates with incredible eloquence the kind of lines of force that connect colonial violence, extractivism, capitalism and the climate crisis. And I think there are writers like Laura Jean McKay, who's here today, Jane Rawson, Jennifer Mills, who are writing really powerful books that try to imagine non-human perspectives. And to go back to that idea of the kind of formal feeling that Smith talks about, they all seem to be books that are doing versions of that formal feeling. They're finding ways of talking about the world, of looking at the world, of showing us the world in ways that we hadn't seen it before. You know, and they kind of engage with the scale of the crisis, but you know, this seems to me the thing that's really important is they engage with its textures. You know, they engage with that kind of sense of yawning loss, of kind of fractured connection, of temporal derangement, you know, cultural erasure. But they kind of go further, and I think they go further and help create kind of imaginative spaces in which it's possible to see both the past and the future in new ways. And I think that perhaps, you know, maybe that opens up a space in which we can, in a larger sense, kind of imagine, you know, different and better futures. Thank you.